Hello. You guys are so scary. I am incredibly nervous, so when I inevitably talk too fast, please forgive me. Maybe give me a wave if I'm talking really fast, and I'll try and slow down. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Katherine. I'm a member here at St. John's, have been for a long time, and I'm one of the safeguarding officers here. I work for Linlithgow Young People's Project as a health and wellbeing worker. Today we're continuing our series on social justice and the minor prophets. Before we get into it, let's remind ourselves of the little definition our group came up with. True justice creates space for our world, our society, to be improved by our response to the injustice. It's a justice that can create space for accountability, healing, and restoration where possible. It cannot be punitive or focused on revenge. The responsibility for justice does not lie only with those who experience injustice, but with all of society. We're all called to bring justice to our society. Today we're going to be looking at the book of Obadiah. Obadiah is the shortest book in the Old Testament, and that's only part of the reason why I chose it. It concerns the kingdoms of Edom and Judah. These two kingdoms were neighbours and had a shared ancestry, both descending from Abraham and Sarah. This connection is highlighted in Obadiah when Edom is referred to as Esau and Judah as Jacob, the names of the two sons of Abraham and Sarah, from whom these kingdoms descended. Esau and Jacob had quite the drama-filled relationship, involving betrayal, death threats, estrangement, mistrust, and deceit. These sibling struggles are then played out again between Edom and Judah. These two kingdoms had a long and complex history. At times they worked well together, they had many commonalities and traditions, but they also had conflict and misunderstandings. But through it all, they remained tightly connected. This all changed when Jerusalem was laid siege to by Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar. Judah turns to the kingdom of Edom for help, but rather than helping, Edom actively caused more harm, effectively betraying their brother in his time of greatest need. Edom had fallen into pride and self-exaltation. They believed themselves to be better than Judah and held themselves in higher regard. This was made worse by the fact that geographically Edom was indeed higher, so they literally looked down on Judah physically as well as relationally. Verses 3-4 read, "The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rocks and make your home on the heights, you who say to yourself, 'Who can bring me down to the ground?' Though you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord." In Obadiah, then, three things are happening. In verses 1-9, the destruction of Edom is foretold. In verses 10-14, we're told this is because they let Judah be overcome without doing anything about it. And in verses 15-21, we're told that Judah will rise up. When it comes to injustice, Obadiah teaches us this. The aggressor will not be victorious and will face repercussions. The victim will be exalted over the aggressors, and punishment and restoration are both required. So let's look at the charges levied against Edom. This is Obadiah verses 10-14. "Because of the murderous history compiled against your brother Jacob, you will be looked down on by everyone. You'll lose your place in history. On that day, you stood there and didn't do anything. Strangers took your brother's army into exile. Godless foreigners invaded and pillaged Jerusalem. You stood there and watched. You were as bad as they were. You shouldn't have gloated over your brother when he was down and out. You shouldn't have laughed and joked at Judah's sons when they were face down in the mud. You shouldn't have talked so big when everything was so bad. You shouldn't have taken advantage of my people when their lives had fallen apart. You of all people should not have been amused by their troubles, their wrecked nation. You shouldn't have taken the shirt off their back when they were knocked flat, defenseless. And you shouldn't have stood waiting at the outskirts and cut off refugees and traitorously turned in helpless survivors who had lost everything." It's quite the list. Murder, doing nothing about invading and pillaging, gloating, self-exaltation, laughing and joking, taking advantage of people at their lowest point, cutting off refugees, turning in survivors. And to reiterate again, because I can't stress this enough, these two kingdoms were like family. How on earth did two nations, as close as brothers, come to this place? How can Edom have come to the point of behaving in this way? And why is it relevant to us? I could, and I was tempted to, use clips from the Lord of the Rings films as a way of demonstrating all of these points I'm about to make. If anyone wants to switch off now and talk to me in the coffee area after and get the Lord of the Rings version of this talk, that's totally fine. Feel free. I wonder if you have a family member you just don't get on with. Growing up, my sister and I were very different people. She was very introverted and quiet, and I was loud and more extroverted. I came across as strong, and she came across as weak. At times, I was a steamroller, not paying attention to what I was flattening, and she wasn't able to realize she was being flattened. There was a narrative in my head that any differences in how we were being treated or what we experienced were solely down to our personalities and nothing to do with my being treated better because I came across stronger. This was the lens through which I saw our differing experiences. It meant I stood there and watched while she was hurt without feeling much guilt because my narrative didn't see it as injustice. It was just how our lives looked different because we were different and I was stronger. Family relationships are often the most complicated and difficult relationships in our lives. So we can see why being brother nations didn't automatically mean things would go well. So maybe we can understand how things might have got to this point. But why do we need to relate this to our context so many years later? I think it's relevant to us because of the verse directly after this. Verse 15 reads, "The day of the Lord is near for all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your head." This verse is a clear pronouncement that this story is not just a story about two kingdoms that got it wrong, but a call for all nations to not do as Edom did, to turn away from pride or whatever it is within us that allows injustice to happen, and instead to live out in a way that brings justice. This is a cry expanded on time and time again by Jesus. The Sermon on the Mount, the parable of the lost sheep, aligning himself to the poor, the hungry, and the imprisoned, the list could go on. None of us want to see ourselves as the Edom in a story, but at one time or another, we all have been, and we all will be again. Whether we look at the micro or the macro level, there's inequality going on all around us, and we're often complicit. It would be easy to come along and use these verses to shame one another for the ways in which we're guilty of letting injustice happen. And maybe sometimes that's what we need to hear. Maybe we need to have our eyes open to the injustices we ignore, dismiss, prop up, increase, laugh at, or take advantage of. But thinking about these verses and their application for our lives today, a different question came up for me. Why? Why do we see injustice done and do nothing? Why do we not notice injustice or insist it isn't actually injustice? What is it that's getting in our way? Maybe if we can figure some of that out, we can do something about our inaction. How do we become as prideful and unjust as Edom? There are endless answers to this, but there are three that I think are particularly relevant. The first is complacency. Full disclosure, when I read the dictionary definition of complacency online, it didn't match what I thought complacency meant. I was at work at the time and I asked a few colleagues what they thought, and they agreed with me. So collectively we agreed that we were right and the dictionary was wrong. So for me, complacency is about a sense of ease and contentment with the status quo, which leads to there being no onus for change. Complacency lets us stay uninformed or even ignorant about the realities of the world. We are often complacent in the way the world is, accepting the status quo and struggling to believe that anything can or will really change. This removes the compulsion for us to do anything about injustice. You stood there and watched. In My Body Is Not a Prayer Request, Disability Justice in the Church, Amy Kenny says that when it comes to being included and valued in the church, complacency is the biggest hurdle. She says, "We talk about the way things are as though the way things are is naturally occurring," and describes how we use this to let us off the hook from actually doing anything or from emotionally engaging in the harm being done. It's what leads people to say things such as, "It isn't good stewardship of our money to build a ramp for wheelchair access to the church." Maybe before last week, you were unaware of the impact poverty had, and it shocked you and made you think. But perhaps since then you slipped into complacency with statements like, "Well, what can I actually do? The issue's much bigger than me. There are loads of charities working on this. Why is my help any good?" When I look back at my relationship with my sister, I see how complacency played a part. I was complacent about how my actions impacted those around me. I didn't notice my sister and others in my life being hurt or steamrolled because ultimately it wasn't having a negative impact on me. Ignorance meant I could live my life and keep living it that way and didn't have to notice that while it was going well for me, that didn't mean it was going well for others. I didn't want to have to change. The status quo was working well for me. I stood there and watched. Secondly, we have defensiveness. Defensiveness refers both to a feeling and a behaviour. Defensiveness is usually a result of someone feeling criticised, called out, or having their perceptions threatened, and results in feelings of shame, sadness, fear, and anger. It can result in behaviours such as sarcasm, ignoring, dismissing, and criticising. Guilty. Often defensiveness is a voice in our head already working hard to avoid having to take in what someone is saying by coming up with reasons why they're wrong or dismissible, rather than letting our beliefs be challenged or our perceptions broadened. You stood there and watched. I wonder whether any of you experienced a little flutter of defensiveness when I read those verses out earlier, and perhaps you made assumptions about what I was going to say. Or maybe when Brianna or Andy spoke in the past couple of weeks and challenged some of your beliefs or assumptions, did the walls and defences go up then? For some of us, tradition, habit, and long-held belief helps feed our defensiveness. How can anyone expect us to change our position on something we've believed for a long time? How can we face up to potentially being wrong or recognising how we may have caused pain? It's no wonder the defences come down, and that when we feel threatened. You stood there and watched. We get defensive as a way of protecting ourselves. It's normal and it's understandable, but sometimes we try to protect ourselves from things we don't need protected from, and the outcome of that is continued injustice for others. Defensiveness uses phrases like, "You just don't get it," "What has this got to do with me?" "I've never seen or heard about that before." But as Brian Stevenson says in his incredible TED Talk, "We Need to Talk About Injustice," we have to care about the difficult things, and we have to integrate them into our own lives, and ultimately, we all have to believe things we haven't seen. I didn't see how my behaviour negatively impacted my sister, and during our teens, there were times when people I got on with well didn't treat my sister well. This was pointed out to me at the time, and in the years that followed, and I got defensive. They were describing things I hadn't noticed, I hadn't seen, so it was much easier to dismiss them. I didn't want to have to change my behaviour or challenge other people's behaviour. I didn't want to have to look at things differently. Even years later, I didn't want to acknowledge it. Defensiveness was the way I protected myself from the pain and discomfort I would have felt if I'd acknowledged the truth. But I let injustice happen when I wasn't able to move past the defensiveness. And finally, we have exhaustion, a state of extreme mental or physical fatigue. Sometimes we let injustice happen because we're tired, because we're exhausted, we're burnt out. Sometimes it's a step further and we're experiencing compassion fatigue, apathy or indifference towards the suffering of others as a result of overexposure to suffering or trauma. This can occur from the news stories and media we consume, the jobs we do, the caring responsibilities we take on, the communities we're part of, or the suffering and trauma we experience ourselves. This overwhelm from holding that emotional burden leads us to tune out, give up, shut down, or disconnect from injustice. It leads us to take things lightly, put up with corrupt systems, and not pay attention. You stood there and watched. Maybe for you, exhaustion looks like an inability to engage with issues of injustice because it's just too overwhelming to even think about it. Maybe it looks like not questioning the conditions the workers who made your clothes were in or how your money is invested. Exhaustion can sound like, there's always something, isn't there? I don't have anything left. It hurts too much. It doesn't feel real. While exhaustion didn't play a part in the difficulties of my sister and I's childhood, it's something that's relevant for us in our relationship now. I work with young people and mental health. Exhaustion, particularly emotional exhaustion, is inevitable sometimes. When I'm exhausted, I'm less able to be there for my sister and the young people I work with. There are weeks when the pull towards shutting down and disconnecting wins out. and I'm not able to be a good flatmate, sister, or friend. There are some weeks where the young people I work with don't get the best of me. There are some weeks where I can't care as much as I should. From the place of exhaustion, I've not taken young people's pain seriously and missed real risk. I've made a joke or taken something lightly that shouldn't be joked about. I've made a sarcastic comment that's left someone feeling like I've slapped them, and I've made judgments and stereotypes and missed the bigger picture. At this point, I really want to tell you that all you need is God, Jesus, or the Holy Spirit, and it'll all be okay. But if you live in the spirit of exhaustion, complacency, and defensiveness, restoration may come, but you will not be part of it. You will be the Edom or the Esau. Verse 18 of Obadiah reads, "The family of Jacob will take back their possessions from those who took from them. That's when the family of Jacob will catch fire, the family of Joseph become fierce flame, while the family of Esau will be straw. Esau will go up in flames, nothing left of Esau but a pile of ashes. God said it, and it is so." It is only by actively working to live in the opposite spirit than Edom that we can make sure we're responding to injustice in a way that allows our society to be improved, to create space for accountability, healing, and restoration. While your relationship with God can be a huge part of this work, it is work. It requires change and action. God can help us with this, but the responsibility ultimately lies with us. It was only when I was able to acknowledge and respond to injustice without the lenses of exhaustion, complacency, and defensiveness that the restoration of my relationship with my sister was able to begin. On my part, I had to apologize, learn to manage my emotions better, admit what I'd done, challenge my perspectives, learn to listen better, and make meaningful change. Becky would like me to tell you all that she also had to change. I could have done all these things, and our relationship might not have been restored. There's always that risk, but it would still have been the right thing to do. We don't always see restoration. We don't always see justice done. Sometimes we have to live and act in the hope, possibility, and promise of God's justice without seeing results. That's really hard. Nothing can make that easier. One thing that is easy for me is getting bogged down with all the injustice I see, with the lack of change and restoration that seems to be happening. And I have to live with that discomfort. But I also need to remember that little justices happen every day. By engaging in this work, we can be part of them. Here are some little justices I've seen recently. When a young person who's always been told they're going to fail passes an exam and is able to believe in themselves a little bit more, that's justice. When young people who experience neglect in their early years become early years workers and give young children the care they never received, that's justice. When someone is able to break the generational cycle of addiction, that's justice. When we are able to have nuanced conversations that allow people to disagree well, that's justice. When my gran struggles but still tries to get the trans person who delivers her papers name and pronouns right, even though she doesn't understand it, that's justice. When a retired CEO who's only ever known money and love begins mentoring a little boy who's only ever known poverty and pain, and that retiree spends hours researching the little boy's interests so that they can connect better, that's justice. When men spend time listening to women about their experiences of sexism and acknowledge them, that's justice. When an exhausted parent continues to fight for their child to get the support they need, that's justice. When a young person who's been kept silent finds their voice and speaks out their truth, that's justice. When a community, usually at odds, come together to support a family at their lowest point, that's justice. When friendships can be restored because all sides have worked on their stuff and recognized the parts they played in the hurt experienced, that's justice. When your little sister moves in with you at 24 years old and you're able to communicate and care for each other well, despite the hurts of the past, that's justice. We do not stand there and just watch. That's justice. And because I just couldn't resist it, I want to finish with this clip. It's a tale of two kingdoms with a long history of alliances, oaths, disappointments, and miscommunications. Anger on both sides, but when the call comes for aid, what will they do?